In America, we have the two-party system where we have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and most people are probably thinking we wish they would just go away and we could just vote our conscience, not our political party preferences. But the truth is, a lot of times as a pastor, people have asked me this question of, should churches identify with a specific political party? Like, how political can churches get? Well, when they identify with a specific political party, for example, let's say a church which is made up of individuals, maybe they're predominantly Republican or they're predominantly Democrat, and they say, well, because we're predominantly this, we're going to identify as Republican or as Democratic or something like that. So with that in mind, people who might want to go to church who may really benefit from the theology or the doctrines of your church, if you've identified with a specific political party rather than just identifying with Jesus, if you identify with a specific political party, then someone who may not identify with that same party might not go to your church, so they're going to miss out on all the things that you could benefit with them with, like sharing the gospel, talking about proper doctrines, talking about the Bible, things like that. They might miss out on all that simply because they don't want to go to your church because you're not of the same political preference as they are. So I would be careful in that aspect. But on the flip side of the coin, in America during this last election, there were certain theologians, famous theologians, who started saying that neither one of these candidates are God-honoring with the presidential candidates. Neither one are God-honoring, and therefore Christians shouldn't vote for either one. And I can certainly see the wisdom in what they were trying to say, but at the same time, we're never going to have someone who's perfectly God-honoring. Only Jesus perfectly honored his Father, but none of the candidates that we're going to ever have will be perfectly God-honoring. And as such, to tell Christians around America you shouldn't vote really hurts America, because they're going to vote, the person who are non-Christians are going to vote for someone, and they may not vote for someone who's going to reflect Christian values or something like that. So I would go, that's kind of the flip side of the coin, where I would say there's a danger in saying that Christians shouldn't be political, because of course Christians, the church, we live inside of America, we live inside of a political country, and therefore we should be involved in that, but not to the point where we're controlling everything, because that's why we have separation of church and state. Now, another thing that I was having a conversation with someone recently, and they talked about, they said, you know, a lot of times people, they think that there's three different lives that we have. There's our spiritual life. That's kind of, you know, when we go to church, we read our Bible, we have our devotion time, we try and learn more about God, we try to please God during our spiritual life. And then there's our political life. That's, of course, when we're getting involved in politics. And then there is our personal life. This is kind of what we do on our own time, whether it's like reading books, playing games, stuff like that, hanging out with family, whatever we do on our personal time. And they said, some people think that those three aren't supposed to mix. But in reality, if they don't mix, this person said, there's really a problem there, right? If you're not mixing your theology, your politics, and your personal life all together, then there's probably something wrong with you. How do you separate all three of those? And I would have to agree with that, but however, I would say that there's a danger depending on how you coordinate or prioritize which one of those comes first and how it impacts the rest of them. Because if you, of course, you can't just mesh them all together, that gets kind of confusing. One has to impact the other. So if you put politics first, for example, and you say, well, politics is my priority, politics is going to affect my spiritual life, it's going to affect my personal life. Well, if that's the case, then you might say, well, what should I believe about abortion, for example? Well, then maybe you're a Democrat or a liberal, and maybe as many Democrat and liberals, they're often fighting for pro-choice, the women's right to abort the baby and things like that. So you might say, well, I mean, I'm a Democrat, so I guess I'm going to be pro-choice simply because I'm a Democrat. So I'm going to be pro-abortion. But then if you flip the coin, not flip the coin, but flip the priorities, and you put theology or your spiritual life first and say, you know what does God want me to do? What should I believe based on what God has told me, rather than what should I believe based on my political party? So if you say, what should I believe based on what God has told me? Well, if God says, for example, in the Bible concerning abortion, there are some passages that could be talking specifically about abortion, where you hit someone who's pregnant and the baby dies. It does say that is a life for a life. So things like that. But there's also other parts that, of course, that just say murder is wrong. So if you look at a baby inside the womb and you say, well, this baby, it actually fits the scientific definition, the characteristics of a living being, and as such, when I terminate it through abortion, that would in fact be killing it, then therefore, if God said that murder is wrong, then abortion would be wrong. So if you take your spiritual life and you let it affect your political life, then it's probably in a better order than if you let your political life affect your spiritual life, things like that. So with that in mind, how should your personal life affect your spiritual life or your political life? Well, I would probably put your personal life in front of your political life. So it would probably be, in my opinion, it would be you should have your spiritual life, what you believe God wants you to do with your life. It should affect your personal life, what you do with your life, which should also affect your political life, how you want people to represent you and your values and things like that. So that's how I would recommend it. Again, if you're trying to separate politics from your spiritual life, it's probably not going to work. There's going to be some meshing, but which one are you going to prioritize first?